All right, so hello everyone and welcome to one of the promised Fandeck showcases for my tournament that will be starting next week. Um, yeah, I asked you in a poll and you were quite indecisive. Like many wanted to see a video on all of the decks that are participating. Many wanted to see um, none of them since you're just not interested in Fandex, which I can understand to some degree. Then there was also the solution just to have me cover a few of my favorites, and that's what I will be doing. Um, I'll be I have a small plan with which decks I want to cover, so I'll probably post one on each day now, maybe on a day twice or something like that. Depending on if I maybe decide again that I want to cover a specific deck or not. Um, and yeah, I'll just start with probably my personal favorite deck overall right now that I have made, which is for Itachi Uchiha from Naruto. Um, First of all, small apology for the ability. Unmatched Maker over here, Unmatched Cards, where I usually design these decks, has a small problem where on the ability, actually, if you just write it down, yeah, it goes a bit further down the screen so you can't see it. But when you actually export the card into like TTS or Warple, it's fully loading. So yeah, you can't read the full ability here, but I'll tell you what it is. Itachi is a melee fighter, technically. 16 health, move 2, and he has no sidekicks, and his ability is at the start of your turn, if there are no opposing fighters in Itachi's zone, he becomes a move 3 ranged fighter for the rest of the turn. At the start of your turn, if there is at least one opposing fighter in Itachi's zone, add +1 to the value of your attacks for the rest of the turn. So those are two conditions. Of course, both cannot be met at the same time. Well, technically they can. Um, well, they cannot. Uh, so if there are no opposing fighters in your zone, you are a move 3 ranged fighter for your turn. So yeah, talking about being melee. And if there is someone in your zone at the start of your turn, well, you're your usual move 2 with +1 on attack. What that ability basically translates to: if the opponent approached you and maybe attacked you last turn and ends in your zone, you'll have an easier time reaching them, so you don't need to be ranged. And move 3, so you'll just keep your melee move 2 and then just slap them hard because they're pretty near to you, maybe even next to you, adjacent. But if the opponent should be running away, well, you have move 3 range, so it's way easier for you to reach and pressure them from a distance. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic because your opponent can also always choose which form they want you to be in, and I might play around that, but both of them are always good for you. I wouldn't say I prefer any of these. It just depends on situation. I think you can always play with both of them. Um, but of course, it also is influenced by the cards. So let's start with them. First of all, we have a 3-value attack for Itachi himself. With a boost value of 4, you have 2 copies. It's Amaterasu, and it says, during combat, increase the value of this card by 1 for each zone the opposing fighter currently occupies. That's basically the same effect that we've seen on Yanenga's Jaws of a Beast, just on an attack only. And remember, you can have +1 on your attacks if an opposing fighter was in your zone at the start of your turn. So this could be basically a print 4, which already makes this a pretty good feint punish. And then since the opposing fighter is always at least in one zone, if you have your +1 turn, this is always at least a 5, but more usually it's a 6, and sometimes even a 7 with good positioning and depending on the map. For example, on Memorial, you can really get this up to a 7 a lot of times. And that's of course a pretty strong attack. But at the same time, it also has a 4 boost value, which is always appreciated. Um, for the second one, we have a print 2 attack for Itachi himself with a boost value of 3. It's the Slaughter of the Uchiha clan. You have 3 copies of it, and it says during combat you may boost this card. And after combat, if you did, draw 1 card. So again, you can technically have this as +1, so it can be a print 3. And your highest boost value in the deck is a 4 with Amaterasu, so you can also get this up to a 7 value attack. And of course, if you boost, you also draw 1 card, which is nice to keep up the hand advantage. you're not actually losing the card that you boosted with, you're just replacing it with something else. That's of course really good, and this is like the more reliable big attack because the opponent can usually position around Amaterasu pretty well, whereas this is just a big scary hit. Even from range, you can get this to a 6 that draws 1 basically on boosting, so that's of course really, really strong. But other than that, your boost values are usually on your more important cards, so you'll probably have to lose something pretty good just to get this up to like a big value, but it's still a really, really good attack. And then for the last red in the deck, we have another 2-value attack. With the boost value, you have 2 this time. You have 2 copies. It says Embrace the Hatred. And it says after combat, move each opposing fighter up to 2 spaces, gain 1 action. Now, we've seen similar cards, maybe for my next trick on Houdini, that are print 2 attacks and gain an action and just have some other like small effects. And this time, you can move each opposing fighter, which is of course pretty interesting because that scales a lot depending on who you're fighting. Like maybe if you're fighting against Wukong, that's insanely good because you can attack a clone with this and then move Wukong out of his safe space. Or same with Muldoon, for example. And it of course prevents the opponent from maybe moving away at some point. This is especially scary if you're in your ranged form, because even if they have like a move 4 or even move 5 effect, since you're ranged, sometimes you can still position them in a way after they moved to still being able to attack them. And that's of course the idea of this card. It's an action gain, so it's always pretty good as a bait to get rid of a good defense. Maybe in a +1 turn, you attack with this first, just to bait out their big defense because they're expecting something like an Amaterasu or a Slaughter of the Uchiha clan. So you can play this, bait it out, gain the action, then second action, after you gain this, slap them really hard, which can of course work quite well. And yeah, it's just pretty versatile. You can also play it to just create distance. If you want to kite with advantage, that's also quite good. And then just maneuver away. Second action, so you always create a at least 4 space gap. So the opponent will usually have to boost. It's just a really versatile card. It's not the strongest on its own, but it can lead to some pretty good combinations. And then going into the versatiles, we have a 3-value versatile first with a boost value of 3. You have 3 copies. This is my conviction. And it says after combat, if you lost the combat, shuffle 1 non-scheme card from your discard pile back into your deck. If you won the combat, draw 1 card. So this is kind of like an interesting one. Of course, it is recursion, and recursion is always pretty strong, but it relies on you to lose the combat, and losing combat with a 3-value versatile, yeah, I mean, it's quite likely. But it depends, because usually if you're going for an attack, you have way better things to attack with, and well, in that case, you're not dealing damage. Sure, you get 1 card back, and you can play a good value game with that. But again, you're not dealing any damage, and you basically used one of your cards without actually achieving something. Sure, you can shuffle something else back, but I think there are better things to do. And if you're defending with this, of course, if you lose the combat, you take damage. So in both scenarios, it's not like optimal for you. Sure, you get 1 card shuffled back, which is definitely a strong effect, depending on what you shuffle back. But in this situation itself, it's kind of bad for you because you lost 1 card from your hand, and either didn't deal damage or took damage. That's not great. On the other hand, if you win the combat, yeah, you draw 1 card. It's not that great. It replaces itself. That's fine. But of course, you usually try to aim for the recursion. Problem with this is a lot of times if you're on a +1 turn, with attacks, this will be a 4, and then losing with a 4-value attack is, I mean, the opponent can play around it. Sure, they usually want to block high, just because you have so many high attacks with Amaterasu or Slaughter of the Uchiha clan that can bump to 7s technically. So they usually want to defend high, but since average block value is 3, you often still win with this, and then you don't get the recursion, and you just feel a bit sad. But it's definitely a fun card to play around, also from the opponent's side. You have 3 copies of it, so you're not that scared if 1 or 2 of them don't trigger, as long as you still have the 3rd one. And even then, it's not that impactful that the opponent has to definitely cancel it or prevent it from actually triggering its recursion effect, like maybe Luke's still standing or something, because it's always only one card each and it cannot shuffle scheme cards, which is also quite important. Because I usually find that shuffling scheme cards in fatigue decks is pretty pretty strong. But yeah, moving on to the next one. It's a print 2 versatile. With a booster of 2, you have 3 copies. It is Sacrifices. And immediately you may take 1 damage to cancel all effects on your opponent's card. And then after combat, you move Itachi up to 2 spaces. So this is interesting because, of course, it's a cancel, but it basically functions like a 1 value cancel, since you have to take 1 damage to actually cancel the effects. Now, the good thing of this card is you can choose whether to cancel the effects or not. So if it happens that you maybe play against Bigfoot and he attacks you with a log and you play this, it's not like that you have to take the damage. You can then just, well, decide not to because there are no effects to cancel and you just play this as a normal Print 2 versatile and move up to 2 spaces. That's still not great, but at least you get some mobility to maybe prevent double attacks. So this is kind of like the perfect double attack killer, because you can always like deny a combo either with just canceling an action gain effect or just moving out of the way. But at the same time, it is self damage and you only have 16 health. So on a solo fighter, that can definitely come back to hurt you. And since, for example, Conviction is also based on losing combat, maybe on defense, that also usually means you take damage. So, yeah, you definitely have to really carefully think about which effects you want to cancel with this, because 1 health is way more costly than you think in this deck. But it's still nice to have a option to cancel effects if needed. And then next out we have another 3 value versatile with a boost value of 1. You have 3 copies. It is One Way Out. After combat, move Itachi up to 4 spaces. You may move through opposing fighters. Deal 1 damage to each opposing fighter you move through. Now, this is basically Stallion Charge from Yin Angus deck, but with 4 spaces of movement instead of 5. I never really understood why it was 5 spaces in Yen's deck, because 4 just feels a lot fairer. Because if your opponent maybe attack you and then moved away, so there are 2 spaces in between you and them, you can move 1 to them, and then the third one on them, and the fourth one you end adjacent, but you still get the 1 ping damage. It's of course pretty good to deal with 1 health sidekicks, which usually move to melee fighters tend to struggle against. So yeah, I didn't want him to have the problem against maybe some fighters like Wukong, to just wall up and then you cry, because Wukong could of course otherwise just send a clone always in your zone at the start of your turn, so you're always in melee form, and then you just cry because you can't reach him. But this card exists, so you definitely have a way to deal with those clones or one of sidekicks in general. But it's a bit more fair to position around, because usually with 5 spaces on movement with Stallion Charge, it's so much. Like, you can basically run from one end of the map to the other with Stallion. So it's pretty hard to position around that if you have multiple and have sidekicks on the board. But I think 4 is just a bit more fair. It's still a good tool to deal with them, but usually you won't get more than 1 or 2 other pings with it, which of course is really good still, because this card on its own is already 3 auto damage with all 3 copies. And then if you also get maybe like a second fighter each time, that adds up to 6 total auto damage that you deal. And that's of course really, really good. But again, I just feel like it's a bit more fair than Stallion, because Stallion just always feels like, oh damn, it's just too much. I can't really position around that too well. And then we get to the first and only 4 value versatile. With a boost value of 1, 3 copies, it is Born in the Flames of War. And after combat, choose 1, recover 1 health, or draw 2 cards. Now, this is a really interesting card, because how you play this will usually determine like your total game plan. Sure, you have a bit of recursion with Conviction. You can be a move 3 range fighter, so you can kite quite well. You have a bit of movement effects, as you saw before with Sacrifices and One Way Out. So recovering the 1 health can definitely be nice, because in that case this basically turns into a 5 value block, or if the opponent just attacked with something lower, you actually recover the 1 health on top, so you're basically a 19 health fighter at that point, which is already pretty tanky in that case. So yeah, you can play quite a good value game if you do that. But on the other hand, if you're just going pretty aggressive and have a lot of +1 turns, because maybe you're fighting against someone like, I don't know, Sinbad, who's always ending in your zone, well, you don't have much draw other than this. Yeah, this might be a good idea just to draw the two, because one healing or two cards, it just really depends on the situation what you want to use. A lot of times, you want to pressure the opponent even more, or you're being pressured. In that case, you want to draw the cards. Only in a few matchups where you really like have the time, maybe Dusa or Yen or Jill, you actually use the healing. Which is quite funny, that healing is not the preferred option to use on a card. And then on the other hand, also if you attack with this, with your ability maybe, it can be a 5-value attack that draws 2. That's like better commanding. So yeah, it's definitely one of the key cards in the deck. And depending on how you use it, the opponent will also get a idea of what your current game plan is. And it's definitely one of the top contenders to shuffle back if you have it, just because it's so versatile. You can either just play the good value with healing or draw a lot of cards and then go aggressive. So yeah, I really like the card, and it definitely like fits in the deck pretty well. And then we have another 3-value versatile. With boost we have two copies. It's the Katsuki. Um, After combat, if the opposing fighter occupies the same amount of zones as Itachi, you may look at your opponent's hand and choose a card for them to discard. Now, this is the second card that kind of requires zone positioning, and of course, this is a chosen discard, and chosen discards, as we know, are insanely strong in Unmatched. If you're playing maybe against Dracula and you discard a beast form with this, that is insane. Or Tomoe and you discard a 7, or whatever. Chosen discards can always really destroy your opponent, because you first of all get to look at the hand, which is already quite nice to know what's coming up, and then you can rip one key card out of their hand. If they only have one block in hand, you rip that out and then can smack them pretty hard. If they maybe have one crucial scheme in hand, you can rip that out. So this is an insanely powerful deck, but of course it's relying on sharing the same amount of zones as the opposing fighter. So there's some positioning to this where the opponent can do stuff. Of course, if they're a solo fighter that is melee, you can quite easily set this up, but on defense at least, that if they maneuver and attack you, well, you play it on defense, and then yeah, it's almost guaranteed to trigger, except if it's offensive cancelled, which is often a pretty good play into him. Um, but at the same time, you're only defending with a 3-value versatile at that point, so you might take a lot of damage in return. And as we saw before, you have a bit of self-damage, and your total health is not that high because usually you use Born as draw, but still, it can definitely work. And on the other hand, if you attack with it, because that's also much easier to set up, because usually, well, you know at the start of your turn how many zones the opponent is in, so it's way easier for you to position around that and then actually get the attack. But then the opponent has two chances to actually deny this effect, either with a defensive cancel themselves, or if they have some kind of movement effect on defense, so they move before your after combat triggers, they move into a different zone amount, and then it doesn't trigger. So it's kind of like Confront from Tomoe's deck, where the effect is insanely strong, but there are definitely ways to play around it. And I find this specific one just quite fitting, because you're always caring about zoning with this character, either with Amaterasu or this card, or your ability, where you care about if there's an imposing fighter in your zone or not. And then last versatile, we have a print 2 versatile. The booster if 1, 3 copies, it's what lies lead to. After combat, do 1 damage to the opposing fighter for each space between them and Itachi along the shortest path. Now, this is a really swingy card. Usually, if you're fighting against a melee fighter, this is absolute garbage, because the melee fighter will always be adjacent to you when they attack you, and then this is a print 2 versatile with no effect, because there's no space in between you and the opposing fighter since he's adjacent. Um, on the other hand, if you're playing against a ranged fighter who's just poking at you from a distance, maybe against Yen, if you set this up, this can be like 2 or 3 auto damage, which is quite nice. Sure, you're only defending with a print 2 still, but that's a good amount of auto damage. But I think more reliably, you use this on attack when you're ranged, because usually your range attacks aren't that high since you don't have the +1. But that's where you can throw this, for example, to deal a bit of auto damage. Yeah, sure, they might cancel, but then I don't have the cancel for maybe something like Akatsuki that shows on this card. Overall, it's quite the okay card only. And of course, the opponent can still reposition around it, centralizing in a zone and not going on like Solomon's on the passage on the bottom right, where you can technically deal 11 auto damage with this or something like that. Uh, but yeah, this card is like kind of the regroup of the deck. It's kind of it kind of exists. You're okay if it deals 1 or 2 auto damage, but you usually don't rely on it. And yeah, it's prime material to discard if you ever have to discard something. And yeah. And then we get to the schemes, because as you see, this deck doesn't have block-only cards. First of all, we have Broken Soul. It's a 2-off scheme with a boost value of 2, and it says choose 1, take 1 damage, then deal 2 damage to each opposing fighter in Itachi zone, or you recover 2 health. Now, again, self-damage. Taking more self-damage is, of course, not great. Because as said before, you're only 16 health, your cancels already require self-damage, and you don't really have that great of healing. Sure, you can use Flames of War, but then, yeah, you don't get the draw, and then you might get pressured a lot, and then you just get slapped to death. So taking another damage is quite costly, but then dealing 2 damage to each opposing fighter in your zone can be really good. If we're talking maybe against Yanenga, holy, this card can get so much value. Or just any 1 health sidekick character. Or maybe they have just an important sidekick overall. Taking 1 damage to deal like basically 4 damage in total if you hit at least 2 fighters. That's pretty strong. I wouldn't recommend this against solo fighters usually. It can be a nice way to finish them off. With auto damage, maybe like Glance from Medusa, where you just deal the 2 and then, I mean, you know you have 4 guaranteed damage with this, so that might work. But usually the healing is what you need. And I would only really recommend the damage against like those multi characters, or if like they position a bit poorly, and then you get a really good ping on both their hero and their sidekick. And then second scheme, we have a Shadow in the Night, which is a boost value 1. You have 2 copies, and it says move Itachi up to 4 spaces. You may move through opposing fighters, gain 1 action. This is kind of like Travelers of the Night from Moon Knight. Basically, it's the same card. Just moving through opponents, gaining 1 action. Really good to set up double attack turns. Maybe if the opponent just sent in their sidekick to end in your zone, you have +1, but their hero is far away. Just to avoid damage, you can play this, move through their sidekick, and then still maybe double attack them. Or if you just don't really have the right cards to boost with when they're too far away, this is quite good. So yeah, it's just an okay mobility tool overall. Having the ability to attack, to double attack twice per game at least, is pretty cool. And of course, it works quite well when you're ranged in combination with that, because then you can just move forward and then poke from range twice, still making the opponent approach. And yeah, that's of course quite good, but it's not like the best thing in the world. And then lastly, we have the last scheme with a boost value of 3 this time, with 2 copies. It's Tsukuyomi. Choose up to 2 opposing fighters in Itachi zone. Those fighters may not attack Itachi on their next turn. Gain 1 action. So, as you've seen before, and as I've told you, you have a lot of self-damage, like 5 in total, if you play all of them. 3 of which are on your cancels, which is quite significant, and only 16 health. Sure, if we like maybe add the 2 healings each, that's 20 health minus the usual 3 self-damage from the cancels. That's 17 health overall, and you only have 3 4-value blocks. Everything else is 3s or 2s, so you're bound to take a lot of damage. And this card just helps you a bit in that regard, where you can guarantee that you won't get attacked on 1 turn, so you can go a bit more aggressive. Maybe draw more flames because you don't have to worry about your health next turn. Or just at some point maybe if the opponent is at 7 cards in hand, you might play this so they can't attack, so they are relying on playing passes or they overdraw. So staying at a really high hand count against him is always a bit scary, just because you might have to discard 2 cards just through this. And since it gains an action, you can just play this first action and then still double attack them. Of course, it doesn't really work against multi-sidekick characters because you can only choose up to 2 fighters. If they just move a different fighter into your zone, yeah, sure, and they can still attack you. That sucks. But since most fighters are only like solo or have one sidekick, this usually works. And even with multis, like you can get rid of them quite well with Broken Soul or One Way Out. So yeah, if you play this later into the game, this can be quite nice for value if the opponent has to discard something due to overdrawing or play a scheme suboptimal or whatever. It's definitely an interesting threat that the opponent has to think about. It won't be like game winning usually, but yeah, it definitely helps you to stay alive, and it's always appreciated. And yeah, that would be it for the small little Itachi showcase. I'll try to keep these videos rather brief, so under 13 minutes, because I don't want to dive into the decks too deep, because I need to do a lot of them. Uh, and it's still Fandex. I would say overall this deck is like really balanced and just pretty well rounded. You can almost handle any matchup. Um, Kind of similar to like Jill or Yananga, but there's definitely counterplay to basically all of the cards, where the opponent can play around them. So it's pretty fun and dynamic. And yeah, that's also why it's my favorite. I definitely recommend you to check it out. At the top, you see the link that the deck is. Download it, try it yourself. And yeah, well then, I'll see you tomorrow on the next one. Bye bye.